"Dad, stop faking just to get attention." The words cut through the dinner table sharper than any knife. He hadn't asked for attention. He had simply placed a hand on the edge of the table because the room spun for a second. His vision blurred just enough that the familiar faces of his children seemed like watercolor smears. But when it cleared, all that remained was his son David's smirk, his daughter Rachel's uncomfortable silence, and the sound of his granddaughter Lily's small voice. "Grandpa, are you okay?" That was how it began, with dizziness and with doubt. Welcome back to Family Shadows, where we tell the untold stories of fathers, quiet men whose sacrifices are often mocked, dismissed, or forgotten, until the day truth comes knocking at the family door. If you've ever felt that your efforts went unseen or your love went unreturned, then these stories are for you. Here, we give voice to fathers who carry burdens in silence and to the lessons that echo louder than any lecture. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss stories like this one, stories of quiet justice, of love mistaken for weakness, of truth arriving when it's least expected. And now today's story. They thought I was faking illness until I revealed who's been paying their health insurance all along. Frank Miller was 61, though in certain moments he felt every bit of 75. He had worked with his hands all his life, building boats along the coast of Washington, sanding planks until they were smooth enough to carry across oceans. After his wife Ellen passed away, the boathouse felt emptier, the wood quieter. He filled the silence with routine, morning coffee in a chipped mug, the newspaper folded in fourths, and dinners with his grown children every Sunday night. This Sunday, he had cooked roast chicken, the way Ellen used to. The smell of rosemary filled the kitchen as David arrived first, with his usual brisk nod and faint complaint about traffic. Rachel followed, carrying a dessert she had bought from the store. Mark, her husband, carried the box as if it were heavy, though everyone knew it was just a cheesecake in plastic wrap. Lily skipped in behind them, her laughter a melody that Frank clung to. The evening had gone well enough. Small talk about school schedules, about Mark's work, about David's new car. Frank listened, nodded, and occasionally laughed, though his laughter was softer than theirs. He reached for the gravy boat when it happened, a sudden spinning as if the world tilted. His hand clutched the edge of the table. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. His face had paled. His chest tightened. He willed it to pass. Then David broke the silence. "Dad, stop faking just to get attention." The words were cruel but spoken with the casual confidence of someone who believed them true. Rachel glanced at her plate, cutting cheesecake that hadn't been served yet. Mark smirked faintly, as if agreeing without speaking. Frank steadied himself, forcing his breathing to slow. "I'm fine," he whispered, but Lily wasn't fooled. She reached for his hand with her small fingers. "Grandpa, are you okay?" He smiled at her, the kind of smile that hides storms behind sunshine. "Of course, sweetheart." Inside, though, he wondered how long he could keep hiding. Frank excused himself to the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, staring at the rosemary sprigs on the cutting board. He remembered how Ellen used to tease him. "You cook with your heart, Frank, but your heart works too hard already." It had been months since the first dizzy spell. Sometimes it came when he stood too quickly. Other times, like tonight, it arrived uninvited, stealing his breath. Dr. Harris had called it cardiac arrhythmia during an earlier checkup, prescribing medication and strongly suggesting follow-ups with a specialist. But specialists cost money, and money was something Frank always thought of in terms of his children. Ever since Ellen's death, he had carried not only his grief but also their burdens. insurance payments, little gaps in their finances, things they never realized were quietly handled in their father's name. He glanced back at the dining room, where David laughed at something Mark said. Did they even notice the bills stopped coming to their mailboxes years ago? Did they know who made sure Rachel's C-section was covered when Lily was born? Or who kept David afloat after his layoff, even when David never said thank you? Frank pressed a hand against his chest. No, they didn't know, and maybe that was his fault. He had kept his silence so long he had become invisible. Returning to the table, Frank tried to pretend nothing had happened, but David wasn't done. You know, Dad, you should cut the theatrics. You always find a way to make dinner about you. Mark chuckled. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, whispering, David, stop. But the damage was done. Frank forced a smile, though his heart pounded. I'll clear the plates. As he stood, the room tilted again. He gripped the table once more, slower this time, careful not to show weakness. Lily's eyes followed him, wide with concern. Later that night, after they left, Frank sat alone with the leftovers, the roast chicken half-eaten, the cheesecake still untouched, the table cleared but not cleaned. He thought of Ellen. He thought of her steady hand on his back whenever his pride threatened to choke him. She had been the one to remind him that asking for help was not weakness, but without her he had slipped into silence. On the mantel, a framed picture of their wedding day caught his eye. Ellen's smile seemed to whisper, "Don't let them forget who you are, Frank." He closed his eyes. His children thought he was faking illness. They thought his weariness was for show. What would they think if they knew the truth? That every insurance card in their wallets bore his name behind the scenes. That the safety nets they never questioned were woven from his labor, his careful payments, his quiet sacrifices. For now he said nothing, but the storm was building. The next morning the house was still heavy with the echo of last night's words. Frank moved slowly through the kitchen, pouring coffee into his old chipped mug. The steam curled up like a ghost, reminding him of mornings when Ellen sat across from him, humming softly while she read the paper. Those days felt like a different lifetime, one where love was loud even in its silence. Now the silence was a different thing. It was cold. It was the kind that came after mockery, after dismissal, after realizing that the people you loved most thought your weakness was a performance. He carried his mug to the back porch. The air smelled faintly of salt from Puget Sound. In the distance, gulls cried and a fairy horn groaned. He sat down, letting the wooden chair creak beneath his weight. The dizziness had passed, but it left behind a strange hollow, like the tide pulling back too far. He thought about David's face, that half-smirk that always reminded him of a younger man's arrogance. Frank remembered when David was 10 years old, standing in a little league uniform, proud of a game he hadn't really played. Frank had cheered anyway, louder than anyone else. A father doesn't count the flaws, only the effort. That's what he had believed then. But now David counted his father's flaws and dismissed his effort. Later that week, Rachel invited him over for lunch. Or perhaps it was less invitation than expectation. She needed someone to watch Lily while she went to the dentist. Frank agreed, of course. He always did. Rachel's kitchen was newer than his, lined with stainless steel appliances and granite countertops, things she and Mark had bought on credit but paid off with surprising ease. Frank never asked how. He only noticed the insurance envelopes never arrived in their mailbox. He wondered if Rachel assumed coverage was simply part of the air they breathed. As Rachel sliced apples for Lily, she glanced at her father. "Dad, about Sunday," she began, her voice low. Frank waited, sipping his coffee. David was out of line, she said finally. He shouldn't have said you were faking, but maybe you overdid it a little. He looked at her, surprised. Overdid it. She avoided his eyes. You know how it looks when you grab the table like that. It makes everyone nervous. Nervous, Frank repeated. The word stung more than David's outright accusation. At least David had been honest in his cruelty. Rachel's doubt was softer, but it carried the same blade. He set his mug down gently, careful not to let the sound of ceramic on granite betray the tremor in his hand. I didn't do it for attention, Rachel, he said. His voice was steady, but inside he felt the floor tilt again. She sighed. I know, Dad, I know, but just try not to scare Lily, okay? The irony burned. He had given up his own doctor's visits to watch that little girl, yet they thought he was the danger. When Rachel left for her appointment, Frank sat with Lily at the table. She spread her crayons across the wood and drew a crooked picture of a man with white hair holding hands with a small girl. Above them, a red heart floated like a balloon. That's you and me, Grandpa, she said proudly. He smiled, throat tight. It's beautiful, sweetheart. She added another figure beside them. And that's Grandma. She's in the sky, but she's still with us. The crayon lines wavered in her small hand, but the love was steady. Frank's eyes blurred. Ellen had been the only one who ever told him he wasn't invisible. She had been the one to place his hand on her belly when Rachel kicked for the first time. The one who whispered, "Don't ever stop taking care of them, Frank, even when they don't see it." And he hadn't stopped. Not when David lost his job and needed coverage. Not when Rachel gave birth. Not when Mark's accident required weeks of physical therapy. The insurance had carried them all quietly like a boat carrying passengers who never noticed the oars. Now, those same passengers accused the rower of faking his exhaustion. That evening, as he was leaving Rachel's house, he overheard voices from the living room. David had come by, his tone low but sharp. He's playing it up, Rachel, you saw it, grabbing the table, groaning like he's about to collapse. He just wants pity. Rachel muttered something inaudible. David pressed on. Don't let him guilt you into more babysitting either. We already carry enough. You know how he is always trying to make us feel bad for moving on. Frank froze in the hallway, his coat half-buttoned. He could hear them, but they didn't know he was still there. Maybe you're right, Rachel whispered. Her words sliced deeper than David's accusations. Agreement from the child who once clung to his leg, begging him not to leave for work. Agreement from the girl whose braces and glasses had been covered by the very policies he paid for. He stepped outside quietly, pulling the door shut before the tears could show. The night air was damp. Streetlights shimmered against the wet pavement. Frank walked slowly, his body aching in ways his children would never understand. He passed by a pharmacy window where vitamins and pain relievers lined the shelves. He thought of the pill bottles on his nightstand, tiny soldiers fighting battles his children didn't even believe existed. At the bus stop, he sat down. He could drive, of course, but sometimes the bus felt easier. Less lonely, strangely. Other passengers didn't know him well enough to mock him. They saw only another old man, maybe tired, maybe sick, but still moving forward. He remembered Ellen's words again. Frank, when they doubt you, let your actions speak. Love doesn't need applause. But what if love, given in silence, turned into a weapon against you? When he returned home, he went straight to the drawer in the living room. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, stamped with the insurance company's logo. Premium receipts, policy renewals, benefit statements, all bearing his name. Frank traced the ink with a finger. He was the policy owner. Every month the money left his account, protecting David's family, protecting Rachel's. They thought health insurance came out of thin air, out of some employer's kindness or some government safety net. But it didn't. It came out of his pocket, his careful planning, his decades of labor sanding wood until his knuckles bled. They thought he was faking illness. But what would they say when they discovered he had been carrying theirs all along? He closed the drawer softly. The time for silence was running out. The phone rang on a Wednesday morning. Frank knew the number before he answered. It was the clinic. "Mr. Miller, this is Dr. Harris's office." The voice said, polite but firm. "We're just reminding you about your specialist appointment tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please confirm if you'll be attending." Frank stared at the calendar on his wall. The date was circled in red, Ellen's handwriting still visible from years ago when she used to mark birthdays and school events. He pressed the phone closer. "Yes," he murmured, "I'll be there." But when he hung up, his chest tightened with the weight of another choice. That same afternoon, Rachel called. Her voice carried the rush of a mother trying to balance too much. "Dad, I hate to ask, but could you watch Lily tomorrow morning? Mark has an early meeting and I can't cancel my shift again, just for a few hours." Frank hesitated. He thought of the clinic, of the hours he would spend in a waiting room smelling of disinfectant, of the doctor's sharp eyes reminding him that time wasn't on his side. But he also thought of Lily, her laughter when she drew pictures of Grandma in the sky, her small hand reaching for his when he felt dizzy. "Of course," he said softly, "I'll be there." Rachel sighed with relief. "Thank you, Dad. I don't know what I'd do without you." He smiled bitterly after the call ended. She had no idea how true that was. The next morning, Frank slipped the appointment card into his coat pocket. He stared at it for a long time, tracing the bold black letters, "Dr. Harris Cardiology, 10 a.m. Then he set it on the kitchen table and walked out the door, choosing instead to drive to Rachel's house. When Lily opened the door, her eyes lit up. "Grandpa, you came." She tugged him inside, showing him a puzzle she had been working on. The pieces scattered like confetti across the floor, a picture of a sailboat half finished. Frank lowered himself to the carpet and began fitting pieces together. Each edge, each corner clicked into place with a patience he had learned from a lifetime of sanding wood and smoothing rough boards. Time passed quickly. He forgot about the sterile hallways of the clinic. He forgot about the beeping machines and the concerned looks of nurses. Here, there was only Lily's laughter and the soft thump of puzzle pieces locking together. When Rachel returned, she found them at the table, coloring pictures of boats and birds. "Thanks, Dad," she said, kissing Lily's forehead. "Was she good?" "Always," Frank replied with a smile. Rachel glanced at the clock. "Didn't you have something today, an appointment or—" Frank shook his head quickly. "Just errands, nothing important." Her shoulders relaxed. "Well, I appreciate it. You're a lifesaver." Lifesaver. The word tasted bitter. He was saving everyone but himself. That evening, Frank sat in his living room, the appointment card still on the table where he had left it. He picked it up, crumpled it once, then smoothed it out again. On the television, a news anchor spoke about rising healthcare costs, about families struggling with premiums. Frank muted the sound. He didn't need reminding. His own premiums had been paid faithfully, their premiums, not his. He had covered Rachel's pregnancy, David's flu hospitalizations, even Mark's therapy sessions after his accident. He had made sure no one ever saw the bills. And yet, when his own health faltered, his children saw only theatrics. That night he dreamed of Ellen. She stood in the boathouse, sunlight streaming through the open door, her hair catching the light. She looked at him with that mix of gentleness and firmness only she had mastered. "Frank," she said, "you can't pour from an empty cup. You've given them everything. When will you let them give back?" He reached for her, but she faded into the dust motes, leaving only the sound of her voice echoing in the rafters. He woke with tears on his cheeks. The next day, Lily called him on the phone herself. "Grandpa, can you come over again soon? Mommy says you help more than anybody." Frank chuckled softly. "I'll always come for you, sweetheart." He hung up slowly, staring at his shaking hand. His heart fluttered again, uneven and irregular. He pressed his palm to his chest, whispering into the empty room, "But who will come for me?" The house was quiet that night, quieter than it had been in years. Frank sat on the edge of his bed, the springs sighing under his weight, the lamp casting a weak circle of light on the wall. On the nightstand lay a row of orange pill bottles. Their labels stared back at him like little verdicts. "Take once daily. May cause dizziness. Do not skip doses." He opened one bottle, shook a pill into his hand, and stared at it for a long moment before swallowing it dry. The bitterness lingered on his tongue. On the wall across from him hung a photograph. Ellen in her gardening hat, standing among the rose bushes she adored. Her smile, forever frozen in summer light, had once been enough to carry him through the hardest days. Now it was a reminder of everything he carried alone. Frank leaned back, closing his eyes. He heard her voice sometimes, not in madness, but in memory. Ellen had always been the practical one, the one who managed doctors' visits, who scolded him for working too hard, who insisted on saving receipts in neatly labeled envelopes. "Don't wait until it's too late, Frank," she used to say. "Don't be stubborn about your health, promise me." He had promised, and yet here he was ignoring the specialist, postponing appointments, placing everyone else's needs above his own. It wasn't stubbornness, not exactly. It was something else. A belief that his duty as a father never expired. That sacrifice was the language of love. But sacrifice, he realized, was becoming a slow erosion. He pressed a hand against his chest. The rhythm there was uneven, like a boat rocking against waves too sharp for its hull. The next day, David stopped by unannounced. Frank was in the garage, sanding an old piece of oak he had meant to turn into a bookshelf. The sound of David's car tires crunching gravel made him pause. "Dad," David called, stepping inside, his suit jacket still on, his tie loosened. "You've been ignoring my calls." Frank looked up, blinking. "Have I?" "I wanted to check on you. Rachel said you canceled an appointment yesterday." Frank's hand stilled on the wood. "I had something else to do." David shook his head, exasperated. "You can't keep pretending, Dad. If you're sick, say it. If you're not, then stop scaring everyone." "Scaring everyone," Frank repeated softly. He ran his palm along the oak plank, feeling its roughness, the splinters still waiting to be smoothed. "That's what you think I do." David sighed, his impatience spilling over. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic. You want us to worry. It's selfish, honestly." The word hit like a nail driven too deep. Selfish. After years of working double shifts so David could go to college, after selling his favorite boat to cover Rachel's surgery, after paying premiums month after month so they would never know the fear of medical debt. Frank said nothing. Silence, he thought, was sometimes the only shield a father had left. That evening Frank couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the wind push against the windows, the old house creaking like a weary body. At midnight he rose and wandered into the living room. The drawer of insurance papers waited, heavy with unspoken truth. He opened it, pulling out a folder. Inside were pages stamped with his signature, his account numbers, his steady payments stretching back more than a decade. Every policy renewal, every premium paid, every little lifeline his children carried without knowing who held the rope. He sank into the armchair and read them under the lamplight. The numbers blurred, but the weight of them was clear. He thought of Ellen again. She would have told him to reveal it, to show them what he had done. But Frank hesitated. What if the truth was taken not as love but as leverage? What if they accused him of control, of manipulation? His chest ached. He clutched at it, closing his eyes. For a terrifying moment, he thought he might not wake if he let go. The following Sunday, Father Lewis stopped by. The old priest had known Frank and Ellen for years. He had married them, baptized their children, buried Ellen. Now he came with a basket of fruit and the patience of someone who had seen too many families crack under silence. "You look tired, Frank," Father Lewis said, sitting across from him. Frank chuckled weakly. "That's one way to put it. Rachel told me you've been unwell, but she said you brush it off." Frank's jaw tightened. "They think I'm pretending, seeking attention." The priest's eyes softened. "And what do you think?" "I think I'm tired of being invisible," Frank whispered. "They don't see the years, they don't see what I carry. They think insurance cards appear like magic. They don't know who writes the checks." Father Lewis nodded slowly. "You've mistaken silence for strength, my friend. But silence, sometimes, is just a wound left untreated." Frank looked away. His throat burned with unshed tears. That night Frank sat once more in the dim bedroom. He turned Ellen's ring in his fingers, the one he had kept since the day she slipped it off for surgery and never put it back on. He whispered into the dark, "I'm doing my best, love, but they don't see it. They don't believe me. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." The silence answered, heavy and unkind. The days blurred after that. Frank continued to watch Lily, continued to pay premiums, continued to cancel his own appointments. The heaviness in his chest grew, but so did the storm behind his children's careless remarks. The time was coming when silence would no longer be enough. The truth, hidden in drawers and envelopes, would have to come to light. For now, though, he sat alone with his memories and his pain, a quiet father carrying a heavy heart. The grocery store was crowded that Saturday afternoon, aisles filled with the hum of families pushing carts, the squeak of wheels, the muffled announcements over the loudspeaker. Frank walked slowly, leaning slightly on the cart handle. He told himself he just needed a few things: bread, milk, some fresh vegetables. But really, he needed the outing. The walls of his house had begun to feel like witnesses to his silence. He reached for a loaf of bread when the dizziness came again. It was sudden, sharp, like a rug pulled from under his feet. He gripped the cart, his knuckles whitening. For a moment the shelves swayed and the chatter of voices blurred into a faraway hum. "Dad," it was David's voice. Frank blinked and saw him coming down the aisle with Rachel. Mark trailed behind, scrolling on his phone. "Dad, are you doing this again?" David's tone was more annoyance than concern. "We're in public. Don't start with the dramatics." Rachel winced. "David, please." But David wasn't finished. He stepped closer, lowering his voice only slightly. "Seriously, Dad, you need to stop. People are staring. You're embarrassing yourself and us." Frank swallowed hard, forcing the room to steady. A young mother passed with her toddler, giving him a sympathetic glance. He wished she hadn't. Pity he could not bear. "I'm fine," Frank said, though his chest thudded unevenly. Mark chuckled without looking up from his phone. "Told you. Old folks always exaggerate. They sneeze, they think it's pneumonia." Rachel bit her lip, saying nothing. Frank pushed the cart forward, each step deliberate. He felt the eyes of strangers on him, curious, compassionate, perhaps judging. He had been a man of strength once, known in town for his steady hands and his wooden boats that outlasted storms. Now he was reduced to whispers in a grocery aisle. He wanted to tell them all that this wasn't performance, that the shaking in his chest was real, that the air sometimes felt too thin. He wanted to remind his children of the nights he had carried them feverish in his arms, rushing through the rain to the doctor, never once doubting their pain. Instead, he gripped the handle tighter, choosing silence. At the checkout line, the confrontation deepened. Frank placed his few groceries on the conveyor, his hands slightly trembling. The cashier, a young man with kind eyes, asked if he was all right. Before Frank could answer, David interjected. "He's fine. He just likes to act frail so everyone feels sorry for him." The cashier looked startled, glancing between father and son. Frank's face burned. He wanted to disappear into the floor. Rachel whispered, "David, enough," but her voice lacked conviction. David shrugged. "What? It's true. He's been pulling this for weeks." The beep of the scanner filled the silence. The world seemed to shrink to that narrow strip of counter, the groceries passing through, the eyes of strangers flicking toward them, then away again. Frank lowered his gaze. His dignity felt smaller than the loaf of bread in his hand. When the transaction was done, Frank carried his bag out into the drizzle. The sky above Seattle was gray, the kind of gray that pressed down on the soul. He walked slowly to his truck, each step echoing in his bones. He placed the bag on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly. For a long moment he didn't start the engine. He just stared at his hands, remembering when they were strong enough to build boats that crossed oceans, when Ellen used to squeeze them and say, "These hands are my anchor." Now they shook, and his children thought the shaking was a lie. Instead of driving home, Frank turned the wheel toward the old boathouse. The building sat near the shore, its paint peeling, its windows clouded with dust. He stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and salt. Here at least he was not a performance. Here the wood remembered him. The benches bore the marks of his tools, the shelves still held jars of screws, the floor bore scars of projects finished long ago. He ran a hand over an unfinished frame, the skeleton of a boat he had started before Ellen's illness. She had loved to sit in the corner, humming as he worked, teasing him about the way he whistled when he sanded. "Finish it someday," she had told him. He never had. The storm of life had taken her, and with her, his desire to complete the boat. Now, standing in the dusty silence, he felt her presence again. He whispered into the air, "They don't believe me, Ellen. They think I'm making it up. But you know, don't you? You always knew when I was hurting." The only answer was the creak of the rafters. Frank sat on the workbench, pulling from his coat pocket an envelope he had carried for weeks. It was his latest insurance receipt, the one that showed his payments covering not just himself but 3 additional dependents, David, Rachel, and Mark. He stared at the numbers. Each premium was like a nail driven into the coffin of his own health. He had bought them safety while skipping his own care. He thought again of the checkout line, of David's dismissive words. He imagined laying this paper down on that conveyor belt, letting everyone see the truth. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he folded it back into his pocket. Quiet justice had its timing. The storm was gathering, and Frank knew it. His children's mockery was sharpening, his body's warning signs louder. The day was coming when silence would not protect them or him. He picked up a sanding block and began to smooth the rough edge of the unfinished boat. The wood resisted at first, then yielded, grain by grain. As the shavings fell to the floor, he whispered, almost as if to the boat itself, "One day they'll see. One day they'll understand what I've carried." And in the hollow echo of the boathouse, the storm clouds rolled closer. The rain came hard that evening, drumming against the windows of Frank's house like restless fingers. He sat at the kitchen table, the single light above casting shadows that stretched across stacks of unopened mail. He had been ignoring them for weeks now, letting the envelopes pile in neat but accusing rows. Finally, with a sigh, he pulled the drawer open. The weight of it seemed to resist, as though even the wood knew what was inside. Out came the files, thick folders bound by rubber bands, envelopes stamped with logos of insurance companies. Frank spread them across the table, years of payments neatly recorded, years of proof that his silence had been more than humility, it had been sacrifice. He picked up the most recent statement. His name, Frank Miller, was listed at the top. Beneath, in neat black print, policy owner, Frank Miller. Covered dependents, David Miller, Rachel Miller, Mark Johnson. Monthly premiums, $1 $472.36. Frank traced the numbers with his finger. Every month, without fail, that amount left his account. While his children assumed their health insurance came from employers or government subsidies, it was his paycheck, his savings, his careful budgeting that had kept them safe. He leaned back in his chair, the papers trembling in his hand. "They don't know," he whispered into the empty room. "They've never known." He remembered a conversation with Ms. Carter, the lawyer who had helped set up the policy years ago. She had explained it carefully in the steady tone of someone used to making the complicated sound simple. "Frank, the policy owner, is the one who controls the contract. That's you. You pay the premiums, those monthly amounts that keep the insurance active. Because you're the owner, you can add or remove dependents. You hold the power, they just hold the cards." He had nodded at the time, not thinking of it as power but as protection. "Coverage," she had added, "is the promise the insurance makes. But remember, Frank, the coverage only exists because someone pays to keep it alive." Back then, he hadn't realized how invisible that someone would become. He set the papers down and closed his eyes. In his memory, Ellen sat across from him, her hands folded on the same kitchen table. "You're doing the right thing, Frank," she had told him when they signed the first policy. "They'll never know what it costs, but that's okay. Parents aren't meant to keep score." He had believed her, but now, as his children accused him of faking illness, the words cut differently. What good was sacrifice if it turned into a shadow that no one saw? Frank pulled out more folders. Receipts from the hospital when Rachel gave birth. Insurance statements when David had surgery after breaking his leg. Physical therapy coverage for Mark after his car accident. Every milestone of their lives was here, recorded not in photographs but in dollar signs and approvals stamped paid. He flipped through them slowly, the way one might leaf through a family album. Only instead of smiles, these pages carried silence. Instead of gratitude, they carried debt no one acknowledged. He took out a notebook and did something he rarely allowed himself to do. He added it all up. 15 years of premiums. Thousands of dollars in hospital bills. Copays quietly handled. Prescriptions covered, surgeries secured. The total was staggering, enough to buy another house, enough to retire on, enough to have spared him the loneliness of skipping his own care. Frank closed the notebook, his jaw tightening. "They think I'm selfish," he murmured. "They think I'm weak, but every breath they take without fear of debt, that's me. Every doctor they've seen, every prescription they've filled, that's me." The storm outside grew louder, wind rattling the panes. Frank gathered the papers into a neat stack, bound them with a rubber band, and slid them into his worn leather briefcase. It wasn't time yet, but the day was coming when these papers would not remain hidden. When the truth came out, it would come not as a shout, but as a quiet unveiling, quiet justice, the kind Ellen would have approved of. He placed the briefcase beside the chair and turned off the kitchen light. In the darkness, he whispered to himself, "They will know. One day soon they will know." The Sunday dinner began like all the others, warm food on the table, polite smiles masking deeper fractures. Rachel had made pasta this time, steam rising in soft curls from the bowls. Mark poured himself a glass of wine, already halfway through a story about a co-worker's promotion. David arrived late, as usual, dropping his coat on the back of the chair with a careless gesture. He looked at his father briefly, then at his phone, scrolling even as he sat down. Frank was quiet. He had carried his briefcase with him, setting it by his chair as if it were any other Sunday, but inside the papers weighted heavy as stones. The conversation began harmlessly enough. Mark spoke about a new insurance plan his company might switch to. David laughed at the idea of paperwork headaches. Then, as Frank reached for the salad bowl, his hand shook slightly. The fork clattered against the plate. The sound was small, but it was enough. David smirked. "Here we go again. Dad, maybe next week you'll bring a cane or a wheelchair. Keep it interesting." Mark chuckled. Rachel looked down, pushing pasta around her plate. The words landed like stones in Frank's chest. He could feel Lily's eyes on him, wide, uncertain. Something in him shifted. A line had been crossed too many times. Frank set down his fork slowly. He reached to the floor, lifted the briefcase onto the table, and placed it beside the bread basket. The sound of the latch snapping open silenced the room. "What's that?" David asked, half amused, half annoyed. Frank didn't answer. He pulled out the thick stack of papers, the rubber band holding them together. He laid them down in the center of the table. Rachel frowned. "Dad, what is this?" He looked at each of them in turn, David, Rachel, Mark, then finally at Lily, whose small hand rested on the table near his. "These," Frank said quietly, "are the years you don't remember, the years you've been carried without ever knowing who held the weight." He slid the top document toward them. At the top, in bold letters, policy owner Frank Miller. Beneath, the names of each dependent, David, Rachel, Mark. David leaned forward, confused. "Wait, this is our health insurance." "Yes," Frank said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "Every card in your wallet, every doctor you've seen, every surgery, every prescription, every hospital bill, they've been paid under this policy, my policy." Rachel's face paled. "Dad, you've been paying for all of us." "For 15 years, Frank answered. "Since the day Ellen passed, I made sure you were covered. I made sure you never saw the bills." For the first time in years, David had no words. His mouth opened, closed, then stayed shut. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But I thought my employer—" "Your employer doesn't cover you fully," Frank said, cutting him off gently. "I've been covering the rest, quietly, every month. While you mocked me, while you thought my weakness was an act, I was keeping you safe." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She reached for a paper, scanning the numbers, the monthly premiums, the signatures in her father's handwriting. Her lips trembled. "Dad, why didn't you tell us?" Frank looked down at his hands. "Because a father isn't supposed to keep score. I thought love meant silence. But silence has turned into something else, something that made you believe I was faking, begging for attention." He gathered the papers back into a neat stack, his movements deliberate. Then he said the words that changed the air in the room. I can't carry it anymore. Not without care in return. Starting next month, I'm pausing the coverage. If you want these policies to continue, you will take responsibility. You will pay, and before you do, you will make sure I get the care I need." The words fell like a gavel. Rachel gasped. "Dad, you can't just—" "I can," Frank interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "Because I'm the policy owner. My name holds the contract. My hands write the checks, and I will not spend what's left of my life protecting children who cannot see me." David pushed back in his chair, his face flushed. You're serious." Frank met his gaze evenly. "More serious than I've ever been." Mark muttered under his breath, but his voice carried. "Well, this explains a lot." Rachel began to cry. "Dad, we didn't know, we never imagined." Frank's eyes softened as he looked at her. "That's the problem, Rachel. You never imagined, you never asked, you never cared enough to see." The silence stretched until Lily broke it. She climbed onto Frank's lap, placing her small arms around his neck. "I care, Grandpa," she whispered. "I'll go with you to the doctor. I'll sit with you, I promise." Frank closed his eyes, pressing his cheek against her hair. Her words were the first balm on a wound that had been open too long. When he looked up again, his face was lined with both sorrow and resolve. "Love is not one-sided," he said softly. "Care goes both ways. I've carried you long enough. Now, if you want me to live long enough to keep sitting at this table, you'll learn to carry me too." The storm outside broke then, thunder rolling in the distance. Inside, the room was silent except for the soft sound of Rachel's tears and Lily's quiet breathing. The papers sat in the middle of the table, a testament heavier than any sermon, the truth, long hidden, finally revealed. The papers remained on the table long after the plates had been cleared. No one had the appetite to finish dinner. The clatter of cutlery was replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. David sat stiffly, staring at his hands. Mark swirled his wine glass without drinking, eyes darting toward the briefcase as if it were an unexploded bomb. Rachel dabbed her eyes with a napkin, her shoulders trembling with quiet sobs. Only Frank was calm. The storm that had raged inside him for years had finally broken. What remained was clarity, like air after rain. "Dad," Rachel's voice cracked as she reached for the stack of papers. "I don't know what to say. We were blind. We were so blind." Frank placed his hand gently over hers. "You weren't blind, Rachel. You were comfortable, and comfort can be dangerous. It makes you forget who's holding you up." She lowered her head, ashamed. David finally spoke, his voice low but edged with defensiveness. "Why didn't you just tell us? If you wanted help, you could have said something." Frank's eyes met his son's. "I did say something. Every payment, every renewal, every sacrifice. That was me speaking. I just chose silence instead of complaint, but you mistook that silence for weakness." David swallowed hard. For once, no argument came. The smirk that so often accompanied his words was gone, replaced by something else, recognition, perhaps even regret. Lily slid off her chair and walked around the table. She climbed into Frank's lap, curling against him as if to shield him from the world. "I'll go with you to the doctor, Grandpa," she whispered. "I'll hold your hand." Frank's eyes softened, tears threatening to rise. "That's all I ever wanted, sweetheart, for someone to see me, to walk with me." Her innocence was the truth none of the others could deny. Later that week, for the first time in months, Frank sat in a doctor's office, not alone but with Rachel and David flanking him. Lily sat on his knee, swinging her legs as Dr. Harris explained the treatment plan. Rachel took notes. David asked questions. For once, they were not dismissive but present. Frank listened, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't perfect, Years of neglect could not be undone in one afternoon, but it was a beginning. When they returned home, the briefcase was placed back in its corner. The policies remained in Frank's name, but the responsibility was shifting. David offered to cover part of the premiums. Rachel promised to manage the paperwork. And Frank, he allowed himself something he had denied for too long: rest. On the porch that evening, he sat with Lily as the sun slipped into Puget Sound. The air smelled of salt and pine. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Grandma would be proud," she said softly, as if she knew the weight of her words. Frank closed his eyes, breathing in the twilight. For the first time in a long time, his heart felt steady. Care had finally come full circle. And so, Frank Miller's quiet justice was not loud or cruel. It did not shame his children in public. It was a truth revealed in papers and signatures, in the language of responsibility that can no longer be ignored. The message is simple, yet powerful. Care goes both ways. Love is not measured only in what parents give to children, but in whether children are willing to carry their parents when their strength begins to fade. Thank you for walking through this story with us. If it touched your heart, we invite you to stay with our Family Shadows community. Subscribe, share, or leave a comment about your own experiences with family, because every story has the power to heal when it's told. From our family to yours, we wish you good health, quiet strength, and the happiness of a home filled with love. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.